My husband's passing left a hole in my heart, but what I learned from a homeless man, well, that truth, buried for so long, that was a different kind of pain. I remember that day like it was yesterday, and only now have I found the courage to tell you all about it. It's a long story, folks, so settle in. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I'm 73 years old. After Richard passed, the only sound in this big old house on Beacon Hill was the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. It wasn't the sound of time passing anymore. It was the heartbeat of a heavy, artificial silence. I've lived here for 40 years, long enough to know the difference between true peace and the quiet before a storm. For the last 6 months, ever since I buried my husband, this house has held that awful, waiting quiet. Chloe, my daughter-in-law, often said I shouldn't be alone in such a large space. "Mother Eleanor, it's just too empty," she'd say, her voice as sweet as honey, but with a persistence that got under my skin. She and my son Dan visited almost every day, bringing the laughter of my 8-year-old granddaughter Lily, a fragile sunbeam in my gray days. But even their presence couldn't dispel the feeling that I was living in an elaborately staged play, a war being waged in whispers and phony gestures of concern. This morning was no different. I was sure I had left my key ring on the little porcelain dish by the phone in the living room, a habit of 20 years. But now it was gone. I checked my coat pockets, the kitchen counter, my frustration growing. "What are you looking for, dear?" Chloe asked, stepping in from the garden with a cup of chamomile tea. She always knew when I needed tea, or at least she always acted like she did. "My keys, I can't find them anywhere." I tried to keep my voice even. Chloe smiled, a smile so sympathetic it felt fake. She walked over to the fireplace, reached up to the marble mantel, and picked up the keys. "Here they are. You left them right here. You know how forgetful you've been lately, don't you?" I stared at the keys. I didn't put them there. I never put them there. The marble was cold and slick, not a safe place for something so important. But Dan, who had just walked in, heard her. He looked at me, his eyes filled with worry. "Mom, maybe you should start writing things down, just in case." I took the keys from Chloe's hand, feeling the cold metal. "Thank you," I said softly. It was no use arguing. It would only feed the narrative they were slowly weaving, the story of a senile, confused Eleanor Vance. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised to be honest and forthright, now looking at me through a veil of lies woven by his wife. He'd gotten thin, and there were dark circles under his eyes that a good night's sleep couldn't fix. "How's Lily?" I asked, changing the subject. Chloe sighed, a perfectly calculated sound. "She had her specialist appointment yesterday. It's the same, really. She's a little fighter, but the costs." She let the sentence hang, letting the silence do the work. Lily, my little angel, was battling a rare disease, a long and expensive fight. I knew they were struggling, but every time I offered to help, Dan would brush it aside with the pride of a man who didn't want to admit he was failing. Just then, the phone in the living room rang. Chloe answered it. "Davies and Finch Law Office," she said, handing the receiver to me. I pressed the cold plastic to my ear. A voice as smooth as oil came on the line. "Mrs. Vance, Robert Davies here. My condolences again on your loss. We finalized the last of the arrangements. Would it be possible for you to come down to the office at 2 this afternoon so we can proceed with the reading and settlement of Mr. Richard's will?" His voice had a practiced sympathy and a haste I didn't like. "Yes, 2 o'clock. I'll be there," I replied, and hung up. When I turned back, Chloe and Dan were looking at each other. For just a second, before they could put their masks of concern back on, I saw it. A flicker of a look between them, a mix of anticipation and something that looked a lot like conspiracy. The play was reaching its climax, and I, unknowingly, was been cast in the leading role. The air in the underground parking garage beneath the financial district office building was cold and stale, smelling of damp concrete and gasoline. Each step I took on the cement floor echoed with a lonely sound. I had parked Richard's old sedan in its usual spot and was getting my purse from the passenger seat when a raspy voice called out from behind a large pillar. "Mrs. Vance." I spun around, clutching my purse. A man stepped out of the shadows. He wore a worn-out army jacket, faded jeans, and a wool cap pulled down low. A scruffy beard couldn't hide the familiar lines of his gaunt face, especially his eyes. Those haunting, blue-gray eyes. My heart skipped a beat. A memory rushed back, uninvited, from a past I had tried to bury. I knew this man. Or rather, I knew who he used to be. "You're Frank?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Frank Miller?" He gave a slight, humorless smirk. "You remember. I'm surprised. Most people from your world try to forget the Millers." Frank Miller, the son of Walter Miller, Richard's best friend and first business partner. Walter, who had lost everything 40 years ago in a brutal legal battle that Richard, my Richard, had won with the help of a young, ambitious law firm. That law firm. "How did you—" I started, but Frank cut me off. "History has a nasty habit of repeating itself in this city, Mrs. Vance. Still the same name after all these years. They're the firm that helped your husband push my father out onto the street. And now your daughter-in-law, Chloe, has hired them to do the same thing to you." My head was spinning. The scattered pieces were starting to click together in a terrifying way. Lawyer Davies's hurried tone, the strange look between Chloe and Dan. "Chloe?" I repeated, not believing it. "What does she want?" "Everything," Frank said flatly. "I've been on the streets long enough to hear things. Conversations people think no one's listening to. I heard your daughter-in-law talking to Davies right outside this building last week. They were talking about the final amendment to the will. They were talking about your cognitive decline. They were talking about transferring control of the entire estate." Every word was a hammer blow to my chest. Frank took a step closer, his eyes boring into mine, not with sympathy, but with a cold, hard hatred for the Vance name. "I thought about not telling you because of what your husband did to my father, but I changed my mind. I'm not helping you because I care about your money or anything like that. I despise every penny your family has," he said, his voice a low hiss. "But I swore that one day I'd see the Davies firm pay for what they did to my father. Your daughter-in-law just gave me that chance. Be careful, Mrs. Vance. You're walking into a lion's den, and they think you're just a weak old lamb. That's all I have to say." And with that, Frank Miller stepped back, melting into the shadows between the expensive cars. He was gone as quickly as he appeared, leaving me alone in the cold of the garage with a truth that was colder still. I sat motionless in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The city noise outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the frantic pounding of my heart and a silent scream in my head. The betrayal by Chloe and Dan was a sharp, unexpected wound. The idea that my own son, the boy I loved, and the woman I had welcomed into my family could plot against me, to strip me not just of my money, but of my dignity and my very sanity, it made me sick to my stomach. They had used my love for Lily, used my loneliness after Richard's death to weave a web of lies. But there was another pain, a deeper, older one that had just been torn open. Frank Miller, Richard's legacy of guilt. For years, I had lived with it, a quiet ghost in our marriage. I loved Richard, but I wasn't blind. I knew he was a complicated man, capable of ruthlessness when backed into a corner.
The way he cut Walter Miller out of the company they built together had always been a scar on my soul. And now Walter's son had returned, not as a ghost, but as a messenger of bitter truth. The two wounds were now one. The present conspiracy was built on the foundation of a past sin, using the very same legal tool. Frank's words echoed in my head. They think you're just a weak old lamb.
They thought I was old. They thought I was broken. They thought grief had clouded my mind and age had weakened my wits. They had written a woe for me in their little play, the pathetic, confused old woman who needed to be protected from herself. A cold, clear anger began to rise in me, quieting the shaking and the panic. It wasn't a fiery rage, but a quiet resolve forged over 75 years of life. I had lived through wars, through economic booms and busts, raised a child, and steered a family through storms. I am not a lamb. I looked in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me had the lines of time etched on her face. Her hair was white as snow, her eyes hollowed by grief. But behind that fragile exterior, something had shifted. A glint of cold, hard steel had just been forged. If they've written a role for me, then fine. I'll give them the performance of a lifetime. I would be the frail, confused old mother. I would let them lead me on, let them get comfortable in their scheme, until they walked right into the very trap they had set. I took a deep breath, relaxing my grip on the wheel. The trembling was gone. When I started the engine again, the sound wasn't lonely anymore. It was purposeful. I was driving to Davies and Finch not as a victim, but as a hunter patiently stalking her prey. The play had begun, and I had just decided to write the ending myself. The brass-plated elevator carried me up to the 34th floor in near-perfect silence, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. When the doors opened, I stepped into a space designed to intimidate. Polished Italian marble floors, the rich scent of lacquered mahogany furniture, and expensive abstract art on the walls. Davies and Finch didn't just sell legal services, it sold power. And today, I was the target of that power. A young receptionist offered a professional smile. "Mrs. Vance, welcome. They're waiting for you in conference room 1. I nodded, making a point of walking with a slight hesitation, as if I were unsure of my footing on the slick marble. I leaned lightly on the back of a chair as I passed, a small gesture of frailty. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her watch me with a look of well-trained pity. Good. The performance had its first audience member. The heavy oak door to the conference room swung open. Inside, Robert Davies, a man in his 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a tailored suit without a single wrinkle, rose to greet me. Beside him was a younger lawyer, an associate perhaps. And on the other side of the table, sitting together, were Dan and Chloe. Chloe shot up from her chair and rushed to hug me. "Mother, you made it. I was so worried." Her embrace was tight, but I could feel the tension in her muscles. She was acting. "I'm fine," I replied, patting her back lightly. The traffic was just a bit heavy. Dan stood too, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Hi, Mom," he mumbled. My son, a tall and once confident man, now seemed to shrink in his chair like a schoolboy about to be scolded. He knew this was wrong. Some part of him knew, but weakness had won. "Mrs. Vance, please have a seat." Davies gestured to the empty chair at the head of the table. That chair, I realized, was strategically placed. I sat, placing my handbag on the floor beside me. I made myself look a little overwhelmed by the fancy room and the serious faces. "Oh my, this is all so formal," I said, my voice trembling just a bit. Davies smiled, a predator's smile. "We just want to ensure everything is handled with the utmost professionalism, ma'am, to honor Richard's wishes." "Richard's wishes?" I repeated, like an echo. "Yes, of course." The meeting began. Davies started with the usual empty condolences before getting to the point. Mrs. Vance, as you know, Richard was very thorough in his planning for the future. However, in his final weeks, he developed some concerns. He paused, glancing meaningfully at Chloe. Chloe took my hand where it rested on the table. Her own hand was ice cold. "Mom," she began, her eyes welling up perfectly, "Richard loved you so much. It's because he loved you that he was worried. He noticed, that you've been a little forgetful lately. He was afraid you'd have to shoulder too much financial pressure all alone." I looked from Chloe to Dan. My son was staring down at the glass tabletop as if it were the deepest abyss in the world. He knew this was wrong. Some part of him knew. But weakness had won. "Mrs. Vance, please have a seat." Davies gestured to the empty chair at the head of the table. That chair, I realized, was strategically placed. I sat, placing my handbag on the floor beside me. I made myself look a little overwhelmed by the fancy room and the serious faces. "Oh my, this is all so formal," I said. Davy smiled, a predator smile. "We just want to ensure everything is handled with the utmost professionalism, ma'am, to honor Richard's wishes." "Richard's wishes," I repeated like an echo. "Yes, of course." The meeting began. Davy started with the usual empty condolences before getting to the point. "Mrs. Vance, as you know, Richard was very thorough in his planning for the future. However, in his final weeks, he developed some concerns." He paused, glancing meaningfully at Chloe. Chloe took my hand where it rested on the table. Her own hand was ice cold. "Mom," she began, her eyes welling up perfectly, "Richard loved you so much. It's because he loved you that he was worried. He noticed, that you've been a little forgetful lately. He was afraid you'd have to shoulder too much financial pressure all alone." I looked from Chloe to Dan. My son was staring down at the glass tabletop as if it were the deepest abyss in the world. He knew this was wrong. Some part of him knew. But weakness had won. Davies continued. "For that reason, Richard decided to make a few amendments to his original will. He established a trust to manage the entirety of the estate. This trust will ensure that all your living expenses, medical bills, and any needs you may have are fully provided for the rest of your life. The trustee appointed to manage this fund," he paused for dramatic effect, "will be your son, Daniel Vance, with the support of his wife, Chloe Vance." A heavy silence filled the room. They were waiting for my reaction. They expected confusion, maybe anger, or perhaps weary acceptance. I blinked a few times, as if trying to process the information. "A trust?" I asked, my voice full of innocence. "Richard never mentioned that to me. I've managed the family finances for 40 years. "This was a decision made in his final days, ma'am," Davies said, sliding a thick binder across the table toward me. "We have all the paperwork right here. The amended will, properly signed and notarized, along with reports from Richard's doctor and a few statements from the family noting his concerns about your cognitive health." I put on my glasses and leaned over the binder. I made my hand tremble slightly. The pages were dense with legal jargon, stamps, and signatures. I flipped to the last page of the amended will. Richard's signature. It was close, but something was off. A hesitation in the final stroke. Richard, even at his weakest, signed his name with a flourish. This was the signature of an imitator. I turned the page. Medical reports I'd never seen. Typed up statements. I read a line from Chloe's entry. "On April 15th, my mother-in-law left the gas stove on for 3 hours. Luckily, I came home just in time to prevent a fire." A bald-faced lie. On April 15th, I was at my sister's house on Cape Cod. I looked up, feeling a wave of rage build in my chest. But I pushed it down, replacing it with a look of tired resignation. I don't remember any of that," I mumbled, looking right at Dan. He flinched. a flicker of pain crossing his face before it was gone. "It's okay, Mom," Chloe said, her voice soothing. "That's why we're here, to help you. Richard only wanted what's best for you." Davies pushed a pen and a single sheet of paper toward me. "Now, Mrs. Vance, we just need your signature on this document, acknowledging that you've been informed of and agree to the terms of the trust. Then it will all be settled." This was it, the moment of truth. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was completely sold on their little drama and my own supposed decline. I looked at the pen. I looked at the waiting faces. I took a breath, feeling the steady beat of my own heart. I'm just so tired," I said, my voice a whisper. I pushed my chair back a little. "I'm sorry. My head isn't clear today. I can't possibly make a decision this big when I'm so worn out." Davy's expression hardened. "Ma'am, this is just a formality. It won't take a moment." "No," I said, a little more firmly. "Richard would never want me to sign anything when I wasn't completely myself." I turned to Chloe and Dan. "I understand about the will in this trust, but I'm too tired today to make a decision right now. Can we postpone this until next Monday? I think this is something our family should discuss again. Don't you agree, children?" Silence. My suggestion was not in their script. It was dangerously reasonable. How could they refuse the request of a tired old mother who just wanted to talk to her son? Chloe was the first to recover. "Of course, Mom, if that's what you want. We'll come by on Monday." She shot a quick, warning glance at Davies. I stood up, maintaining my weary posture. "It's settled then. 7 o'clock. Without another word, I turned and walked slowly out of the room. I could feel all of their eyes on my back. What were they thinking? That I was just delaying the inevitable? Or had a tiny seed of doubt begin to sprout in their minds? When I got home, my pretend fatigue vanished, replaced by a sharp focus. 4 hours. I had 4 hours to prepare for the most important confrontation of my life. The first thing I did was call Brenda, my best friend of 50 years. "Brenda," I said as soon as she picked up, "I need you to do something for me tonight. Around 7:15, I'm going to call you. I'm going to ask you about our trip to the supermarket last month. I need you to just tell me exactly what happened. Can you do that?" "Eleanor, what's going on? You sound strange." "I'll tell you later. Just promise me you'll be by the phone." "Of course, dear. Anything." The second call was harder. I found the number in Richard's old address book, a number dusty in my memory. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Thompson Private Investigations." "Mr. Thompson," I said. "It's Eleanor Vance, Richard's wife." There was a pause. "Mrs. Vance, it's been a long time. I'm very sorry to hear about Richard." Thompson was a seasoned PI, Richard sometimes hired for discreet business matters. He was quiet and efficient. "How can I help you?" "I need information," I said, my voice firm, "on the financial situation of my son, Daniel Vance, and his wife, Chloe Vance. Debts, mortgages, credit cards, anything you can find, and I need it as soon as possible. Oh, and one more thing. Could you connect me with a handwriting expert? I'll be sending over a document for analysis." "I understand," he said, without a hint of surprise. "I'll get right on it." Finally, I walked into Richard's study, a place I had avoided for 6 months. The scent of old paper and his aftershave still lingered. I went to the safe hidden behind a landscape painting. I spun the combination that only the two of us knew. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside, next to the important papers, was a thin file tied with a red ribbon. "Miller, Walter," read Richard's handwriting on the tab. I knew it was there. Years ago, on a sleepless night, Richard had confessed everything to me, his torment over ruining his best friend. He kept this file as a form of penance, a reminder of the price of his ambition. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. It wasn't a weapon. It was the truth. By the time the grandfather clock struck 7, I was ready. The house was quiet. The chandelier in the living room was lit, casting a warm glow on the oak furniture. Richard's portrait, with his mysterious half-smile, looked down on the scene. On the coffee table, next to 2 steaming cups of tea, sat the Miller file, placed discreetly but impossible to miss. The doorbell rang. I took one last deep breath. Act 2 of the play was about to begin. And this time, I wasn't just an actor. I was the stage, the lighting, and the narrator. That weekend, the house on Beacon Hill was no longer a place of quiet grief, but a war room. I spent Friday going through every memory, stringing together Chloe's little lies, her meaningful sighs, the times Dan avoided my gaze. Everything was now as clear as print on a white page. Then, on Saturday evening, a thought struck me. Chloe's future accusation, that dirty money, it seemed to have been planted by Frank Miller. But how would Chloe have known? Unless Richard himself, in a moment of weakness, had let something slip. A guilty conscience. A dying man often looks for absolution. I went into Richard's study, which I'd kept exactly as he'd left it. I sat in his leather chair, taking in the familiar smell of old books and cedar. Richard was a meticulous man. He never threw away anything important. But the Walter Miller file wasn't in the main filing cabinet. I began to search. In locked drawers, in the safe behind the bookshelf. Nothing. Exhausted, I dropped my head on the desk, and my hand brushed against a small ridge underneath. A secret drawer. I'd lived here 40 years and never known. It didn't have a lock, just a small latch. Inside was a single, time-yellowed file. Miller, Walter. My heart pounded. I opened it under the desk lamp, my hands shaking. Inside wasn't just dry legal documents. There were a few old photos of a young Richard and Walter, smiling, full of hope. There was a clipping from the Boston Globe about the bankruptcy of Miller Construction. And tucked in the last page was something that took my breath away. A handwritten letter in Richard's frail late-life script addressed to Frank Miller.
To Frank, it read, "You will probably never read this, but I have to write it down. Not a day goes by that I am not haunted by what happened to your father. Ambition made a monster of me. I stole not just his company, but the honor of a good man. I leave Eleanor with a burden and a task. I hope she will be strong enough to do what I never had the courage to do. Forgive me." The letter had never been sent, but it was proof of his remorse. It was the soul of Richard's true last will. I folded it, tears streaming down my cheeks. This wasn't just a weapon against Chloe. This was a chance to redeem my husband's soul. On Monday morning, just as promised, a courier left a thick envelope on my doorstep. Thompson's report. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea and read. The numbers danced before my eyes, telling a story of desperation. 2 mortgages on their Brookline house, one nearing foreclosure. Nearly $200,000 in credit card debt, filled with lavish expenses for Caribbean vacations, designer handbags, expensive dinners, and a string of rejected business loan applications for Dan. Their total debt was approaching $1 million. It was all clear. They weren't just struggling, they were drowning, and they were willing to pull me down with them. I placed Thompson's report next to the Miller file. I had everything I needed. All that was left was for my actors to arrive. The doorbell rang. I opened it. Dan and Chloe entered, their faces even more tense than before. The last few days of waiting must have been torture for them, too. We sat in the living room, in the same spots as last time, but this time the air was completely different. I was no longer playing the tired old woman. I sat straight-backed in my armchair, my calm composure making them visibly nervous. On the coffee table, beside the tea set, were 2 files, Thompson's thick envelope and the old faded Miller file. "You're looking better, Mom," Chloe began, trying to break the silence. "I am, thank you," I replied, my voice like ice. I had a very productive weekend. I learned a great deal. I looked directly at Dan. "Before we talk about your father's will, maybe you can explain this to me." I took a single sheet of paper from Thompson's envelope and slid it across the table. It was the foreclosure notice on their second mortgage. The color drained from Dan's face. He stared at the paper and stammered, "Mom, I can explain. It's just a temporary business setback. Everything's going to be fine." That was my Dan, evasive, minimizing, always hoping problems would just disappear. Chloe immediately jumped into her role as the protective wife. "Dan is under so much pressure. You wouldn't understand. You've had a comfortable life. You don't know how harsh the real world is. Besides, with your memory these days." She went on the attack, a classic defense tactic. "That's enough, Chloe," I cut her off, my voice now arctic. I picked up the telephone. Let's just test how bad my memory really is. I dialed Brenda's number, put it on speakerphone, and asked her about April 15th. The story of our supermarket trip unfolded exactly as I knew it had, not the tale of me forgetting the gas stove. Brenda's cheerful, oblivious words were hammer blows, shattering Chloe's lie. When I hung up, the room was deadly silent. That's when I turned to my son. I wasn't angry anymore, just filled with a bottomless sorrow. "How did I raise you, Daniel? I taught you about honesty, about honor. Look at me. Do you really believe your mother has lost her mind, or did you just choose to believe it because it was easier than facing the fact that you had failed?" That was the last straw. Dan broke. It wasn't just quiet sobs. He wept, the heaving, racking sobs of a completely broken man. "I'm sorry, Mom," he choked out. "I'm so sorry. It was Lily, the bills. I didn't know what to do. I'm a failure. I failed everyone. I'm sorry." I pushed Thompson's full report toward him. "I offered to help so many times," I said, my voice thick with sadness, directed at Dan. "Lily's bills. She's my granddaughter, too. Why, Dan? Why did you refuse and let it come to this?" "Because I'm a failure," Dan roared, years of suppressed inadequacy exploding out of him. "Don't you get it? I'm not Richard Vance. I ran the business into the ground. I couldn't provide for my own daughter. What right did I have to ask you for anything?"
His painful confession was cut short by Chloe's cold laugh. "He's not a failure," she said, standing up, her eyes locked on me. "He's just too decent to live in a world of sharks, just like my father was, Walter Miller." The name hung in the air. "What did you say, Chloe?" I whispered, though my heart had already started to pound. "You heard me," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "I'm his daughter, and when Richard Vance was dying, he confessed everything. He said half this fortune should have been my father's. I'm not stealing. I'm taking back my stolen legacy." She was at the peak of her self-righteousness, a daughter enacting justice for her wronged father. But just then, a raspy, tired voice came from the doorway of the living room. Taking back what? A lie? We all spun around. Frank Miller was standing there, his gaunt face a mask of pain. The front door hadn't been locked. "Mr. Miller?" I said, stunned. Frank didn't look at me. He walked into the room, his eyes fixed on a shell-shocked Chloe. I heard the shouting. I heard my father's name. "You think you know the truth? You think your father was some kind of martyr?" "What are you talking about?" Chloe stammered. "Richard Vance destroyed him." "No," Frank boomed, and for the first time, I saw tears in his hardened eyes. "The truth is more complicated. Richard Vance and Walter Miller, they were best friends and partners in shady deals. They made money together, and they covered up their mistakes together. That so-called lawsuit was just a show, a way for one of them to take the fall when things were about to blow up. My father lost that coin toss, but he was no innocent victim." The truth hit the room like a physical blow. Chloe swayed on her feet. "No, that's not possible."
His death was an accident, Frank continued, his voice cracking. He fell apart and turned to the bottle. Nobody killed him. He destroyed himself with his own bad choices, just as Richard Vance lived with the guilt for the rest of his life. Frank turned to me. I came to warn you, Mrs. Vance, not because I wanted revenge for my father. It was because I couldn't stand by and watch another generation get destroyed by the lies of the last one. The room was silent in the face of this brutal truth. The heroic tragedy Chloe had built to justify her actions crumbled into dust. Her father wasn't a victim. She wasn't an avenger. She was just a desperate person repeating the mistakes of those who came before. And that's when I delivered the final blow. And there is one more lie, I said, my voice chillingly calm. I pulled another file from a briefcase I had prepared. I hadn't just been waiting. Mr. Thompson's report had given me more than just debt records. It had given me the name of a top handwriting expert. I placed a report on the table. The signature on the amended will, the one establishing the trust, it's a forgery. A sophisticated one, but a forgery nonetheless. The last bit of color drained from Chloe's face. So, this morning, I continued, I made a call to my husband's private attorney. With this proof of forgery, he was able to get a court order to unseal and access Richard's original will, the one stored in a bank's safe deposit box. I slowly stood, walked into the study, and returned with a carefully sealed envelope. Everyone watched, holding their breath. This, I said, placing it on the table, is the true last will and testament of Richard Vance. I broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I cleared my throat and read aloud. I, Richard Vance, being of sound mind, do declare this to be my final will. My entire estate, properties, and investments shall be transferred into a trust fund to be named the Lily Vance Hope Fund. Dan and Chloe looked up, stunned. I continued reading. This fund will serve two primary purposes. One, to unconditionally cover all medical, educational, and welfare expenses for my granddaughter, Lily Vance, until she reaches adulthood. 2, the remainder of the assets will be used to establish and fund a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support for families with critically ill children, so that no child has to pay the price for their parents' mistakes or desperation. I paused, looking my son and daughter-in-law in the eyes.
As for my son, Daniel Vance, I read the final line, I leave him no money, for that is the easy way out. I leave him something more valuable, a chance to become a man he can be proud of on his own, and a reminder that the greatest legacy he can leave is the well-being and security of his own daughter. Richard's true will wasn't punishment, nor was it a handout. It was the deep understanding and compassion of a man who had made many mistakes, but in the end saw what truly mattered. He had been worried about Lily's illness. He had seen the desperation in his son and daughter-in-law, and he had chosen a path of redemption, not condemnation. The room broke. Chloe sank to her knees, not in defeat, but in the shock of unexpected grace. Dan cried, not from shame, but with pride for the father he had never truly understood. Frank Miller stood quietly in the corner, the slightest hint of a smile on his lips for the first time in years. I folded the will. The war was over. There were no winners or losers, only lost people who had finally found their way home. The legacy of Vance and Miller was no longer a blood debt. It was reborn as a legacy of hope, built on the love for a child. And that was an ending we could all live with.